Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final week of readings. We're going to talk about postmodern and contemporary literature. All right, so first let's talk about Salman Rushdie. He was born in 1947, which is just a very interesting year to be born. He is still alive. He survived an attack a couple years ago. He was born in Bombay, now called Mumbai, 2 months before India gained independence from the British. And so just like a very specific year, he actually wrote a book called Midnight's Children, which is kind of his like big hit, his second novel, that is specifically about children born on the day 2 months after he was born, when India gained independence. Another fact about him is that he was born to a Kashmiri Muslim family in India. And so this was the year of partition. I included a link here if you want to learn more about partition. And specifically, I also have a link to just a Wikipedia page about religious persecution in India. But there are a lot of different, there are people of a lot of different religions who live in India. It's a big country, very diverse country, lots of languages there, lots of religions there. And one of the things that happened during this time period is that there was a lot of violence between these religious groups, and maybe specifically and most importantly between Muslims and Hindus in India. And this is where there becomes sort of an agreement that Muslims will leave the country. I mean, it's more complicated than this, but that Muslims will go to Pakistan and Hindus will stay in what is now India. And there's a lot of violence around that and a lot of persecution. So that's kind of important as a detail, thinking about Rushdie's literature and specifically some of the stuff we're going to get into with his, the call for his assassination, for example. Okay, moving on. So he studied at Cambridge before he worked as an actor, which is interesting, and as a freelance copywriter for advertisers. So he did that for 10 years before he published his first novel, which ended up being kind of like not very successful, which, it happens. You almost don't want your first novel to be the big success, right? Because then it's like a lot of pressure. His second novel, Midnight's Children, won the Booker Prize. And the way that the Norton Anthology describes this win is so intense. It's like they describe it as the Booker Prize winner. Like in the history of the Booker Prize, it's the most important book ever awarded the Booker Prize. So just to put things in perspective, this wasn't just like a win, like, wow, look at this up and coming writer. It was like, stop everything. This writer is really important. He has something really important to share with us. Okay, and so then one of the things that I think Rushdie is most famous for is this fatwa that was put on him because of a book that he wrote and published in 1988, so a long time ago, called The Satanic Verses. And what ended up happening was this book was so controversial. It depicts a character that's clearly supposed to be the Prophet Muhammad. And it's sort of playful, and I think we could say irreverent, disrespectful, and blasphemous to some, right? And so it actually caused riots to break out in majority Muslim countries, places like India, Pakistan, and South Africa, and among others. And basically, the leader of Iran at the time called for his assassination, and he actually died really shortly after. Not Salman Rushdie, but the leader died really shortly after he did proclaim that declare that fatwa. But it was basically 10 years that Rushdie was like constantly monitored by British Royal Guard, I think is what it's called. He was constantly protected because there was such a huge threat on his life. He was getting a lot of death threats. And there were a lot of terrorist acts that were attributed to his book, right? That were, people would do a terrorist act and say, this is because of Rushdie. And so anyway. really recently. So, long after it seemed like people had moved on from this issue, he was actually attacked. So this was in 2022. He was doing a lecture at, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce the name probably, but it's Chautauqua, I think, Institution in New York. Um, and he and I think the host of this lecture were both stabbed, were both attacked, suffered injuries. Nobody died. Salman Rushdie did. I think there was a time when people thought he was going to die. He was on a ventilator, and he did end up losing eyesight in one of his eyes. I'm not sure if he actually lost the eye, but he always has now like a black, um, you know, uh, his glasses are blacked out on one side, and he also lost the use of one of his hands. So he wrote this book called Knife. This was just released this month, actually, about this experience, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm very curious about it. And he did an interview on the Daily Show that I watched maybe last week that I thought was really interesting. So I just wanted to share that with you in case this is something that you're interested in. I would also just add that the guy who stabbed him is from New Jersey. So Rushdie has some interesting comments on kind of I think he says something in the Daily Show, and I should have rewatched it, but I think he says something like this was a uniquely American event or act of violence. Okay, so The Prophet's Hair. This is published in 1981, the same year as Midnight's Children. And there's a few different reasons why I think this is such a big, huge, important story. And by the way, that's not my opinion. This is in the Norton Anthology. It's just constantly brought up as, it's in our textbook, right? It's constantly brought up as like this really important text that everybody should read. And I think the fact that it's a short story makes it so that we can read something that's complete from Salman Rushdie without having to read all of Midnight's Children or the Satanic Verses or any of his other works that are novels. He does have other short stories. One of the things that he's most famous for is his use of magical realism. And I don't know how familiar you are with magical realism, but it's I'm going to oversimplify it. So I have some definitions here, articles that you can read if you want to get a little bit more in depth. But essentially what we have with magical realism is we have a realistic setting. We're trying to capture, and realism is like an important, this is an important literary and artistic movement, but we're trying to capture like what real life is really like. And magical realism is really pushing back against that, because what happens is you have this very realistic setting and then you insert fantastical elements. So this could be something like, and now I'm going to completely blank. There could be like creatures, like fantasy creatures. There could be things like manipulation of time. There can be, all kinds of different things that don't really exist. Curses, for example, things that are from fantasy, but then are being put in a hyper realistic type of setting or very realistic type of setting. And so it's not quite the same as fantasy. Fantasy is going to be, you're basically you have a world in which there's multiple elements of fantasy taking place at once. This is going to be usually like selective. So there's going to be mostly realistic things, realistic world with some sort of fantasy inserted that maybe is taken for granted or maybe is surprising. And I have some quotes in here. Maybe I should have just read this, but one other thing I wanted to point out here is the way that the story has been kind of categorized sometimes. So the Norton Anthology talks about it. It says the story is at once a moral fable in the tradition of the 1000 or the 1001 Nights, and a magic realist extravaganza paced with incident, poetic detail. I think it's supposed to be packed. Water to which the cold of night had given the cloudy consistency of wild honey, and humor all brilliantly interwoven at breakneck speed. And so they're kind of talking about like the complexity of this story. I don't know if you also got this, like kind of this reminded you of any of the other kind of fable types of works we've read before. But it did for me. When I was reading it, there feels like there is kind of like a morality going on here, but it's definitely postmodern because it does not remind me of something as straightforward as Goblin Market, for example, where we have, I mean, not that that isn't a complex work, but where I think the sense of morality is pretty clear. And I think the morality is a little bit more complex. There's like a little bit more of a sense of like criticism of maybe traditional religion or a very fundamentalist religion, and specifically in this case, Islam. But then also critiques of some of the other morality going on in the story, right? Because it's not all it's more complicated than just that, right? Okay. So a couple of interesting things I wanted to share with you. So one of the things is that this story is likely inspired by an actual theft of the prophet's hair, from and I'm again, Hazrat Bal's shrine in Kashmir, which by the way is a disputed territory, but considered part of Indian, shoot, I can't think of the word, but they're kind of in control of it right now, but it is a disputed territory. And this happened in 1964, and it actually led to communal riots in East Pakistan and the adjoining Indian areas of Calcutta and West Bengal, where many Hindus and Muslims were killed. And so I have a link to the story here from the New York Times, but this is something that really happened. And it's just kind of an interesting choice of event for Rushdie to write about, just kind of considering his history and his experience and the kinds of things that he seems to be commenting on in the story. Another thing that I wanted to read, this is just another quote from the New York Times that I found really interesting, or not the New York Times, from the Norton Anthology. Likes the satanic verses, the prophet's hair risks playfulness, satire, caricature, and whimsy in its treatment of the religion of Rushdie's youth. And so even though this was written before the satanic verses, or at least published before, and definitely is not, well, as far as I know, is not nearly as controversial as the satanic verses. There is, the satanic verses, the problem with that, the reason that's so controversial is because of its depiction of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad character, that is kind of poking fun at him. So people are offended by that. This is more about the religious practices, culture, and maybe people practicing, than it is of, the religious doctrine itself, right? Or maybe not, but it's not Muhammad, right? Okay. There's more to say about this story. I think one thing I would just say about this story is that it's been a while since I've read it. And I should have put this in here too, but this story has a kind of an interesting narrative structure, I think, because when I read it, it really felt like maybe it's happening in media res, which isn't necessarily uniquely postmodern, but I just feel like the structure of the story made it so that it feels very circular to me, in its construction, where I finished the story and then I went back to the beginning and read it again. Because if you remember, it does kind of have like a slightly nonlinear storytelling. The facts are unfolding as the story continues, which again is not uniquely postmodern, but it's just kind of an interesting thing that I'm interested in learning more about. Another thing is it's just really a page turner. I thought it was really, really compelling. Okay, let's move on though. M. Carroll. So they were born in 1983, so almost 40 years after Rushdie. And they're born in London, Ontario, which is in Canada. And I don't think we read any other Canadian literature this semester, but Canada is technically still part of British Commonwealth, along with like New Zealand. There were some other places that we haven't really read literature from, but that I wanted to draw some attention to. There is still kind of there is still kind of an empire, right? If you look up some of these countries, or if you learn more about the British royal family, you'll learn that they still have, some, or you watch the news, they're still visiting countries around the world that they have some stake in, right? Or some control over. Okay, so let's talk about Carroll, though. They have published some award-winning comics. I think probably the most famous one is this comic called Through the Woods, which is sort of an anthology, which actually includes the story that we read for class. This collection won an Eisner Award two Eisners. Maybe it won two Eisners. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting now. But it is a really wonderful book. If you haven't read it, it's very, very easy to find at the library. If you have a library subscription anywhere, most libraries have it. And they actually came out with a new book this year called A Guest in the House, which is very creepy and kind of gross and fantasy. And I think you might really like it. Some more magical realism, perhaps. If you'd like to read more comics by them, I went ahead and linked to their page. You might have already looked at it, but I think I linked directly to the comic for the class. And so I just wanted you to know that there are a lot of web comics that they've published, actually. So his Face All Red, this was published on Halloween of 2010, and you can see the live post. Live journals like a social media, right? Old social media. You can actually see this post on Web Archive, Internet Archive. It's a web comic originally, right? So it's been republished in print. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that in an interview, Carol talks about how they actually prefer this as a web comic. And part of it is because of the element of scrolling, because this is a horror comic. And one of the things that is hard about horror comics is that, and they talk about this isn't me, but my experience too. You can peripherally see, by the way, I'm a comic scholar. I don't know if I've talked about that. You can peripherally see the thing that's about to happen on the next page, right? It's kind of like if you leave the captions on your TV when you're watching a horror movie, sometimes it spoils the next thing that's going to happen for you because it will tell you what's about to happen. The door slams or a ghost jumps out or whatever, and you're like, oh, okay, well, now I know what's going to happen and I'm not going to be scared. It's a similar thing with a print comic. And so one of the things that Carol says is they say, I think scrolling creates a sort of tension because you reveal things bit by bit, as opposed to a page where in your peripheral vision, you see the rest of the page. So by scrolling, we're kind of uncovering the next part of the story in a way that could surprise us, right? I don't know how familiar you are with web comics, if you've read Webtoon or comics at all. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is, but this is a really booming genre, right? Or medium. And so basically what we're talking about with webcomics or digital comics, it's just going to be comics that are posted on the internet. And they typically are very serial like, and so this isn't a serial comic. This is published all at once. But as far as I know, I hope I'm not misremembering that. But like, for example, one of the big comics right now is Lore Olympus. There have been other comics like Hark a Vagrant, which is another one that I considered, that have been published over years and years. And sometimes it's just kind of like another funny thing that this person thought of and made a comic about. And sometimes it's like you're dying to know what happens next. And so there's a lot of different types of web comics, but it's a huge, huge, huge field right now. Okay, so let's talk about his Face All Red, and especially kind of in terms of postmodernism, or contemporary lit, if you will. So basically, there are a few things here. One is that this has a very ambiguous ending. We're not 100% sure what's happening at the end. Not to mention, we're not really sure what's going on maybe during the story, right? It's very mysterious. Nothing is really answered for us necessarily by the ending. We can interpret things in different ways, but we don't have a solid answer. This is what happened. It's revealed. And one of the things that I think is important is that this is a horror comic, right? And so horror, this is very common in horror narratives because it's kind of and you know what, let me just read this Carol quote. They say, yeah, there's a point in horror stories where you figure out how to defeat the evil thing, and once that happens, it's over. I really didn't want that because in my work, I want to evoke an emotional reaction in people, or at least an unease, in a fun way. I don't want to wrap things up because I'd rather have that unease linger. And at least for me, this is the difference between like a good horror movie and a bad, or not bad, but like average horror movie, is if I feel scared still when it's over. Um, I tend to feel like if too much is revealed and I really understand exactly what happened and the monster is dead or whatever, there's a nice release, right? If really you feel relieved, you're not worried anymore, but you're also not scared anymore. And maybe the movie doesn't really feel scary anymore. It's movies like it follows or something like that. We're not totally sure what's going on anymore. There's sort of an open ending, right? That I think, unfortunately now make me always think, well, there's going to be a sequel. That's obviously what this is. But I think, at least traditionally, was more about the nature of reality and the fact that there isn't always an easy ending or answer, but that things are constantly shifting. There's different ways to interpret a situation. There's different ways to perceive a story. And so, yeah, I think it's just kind of an interesting thing I wanted to make sure and point out. And then one other thing I wanted to point out is that this has what we'd probably refer to as an unreliable narrator. This isn't necessarily like the most obviously unreliable narrator I've ever seen in literature, but I think anybody who's a murderer is probably pretty unreliable. And I think especially when we can see a little bit of a clash between the way that they're describing things versus maybe the imagery on the page, especially because the imagery is pretty vague. There's a lot of moments of obscurity where we're not necessarily sure what we're seeing, or, is it through their eyes? It's a first person narration. So is it through their eyes, or is this what's really happening? And I think that there's a little bit of again, like an unanswered quality to that. It's not 100% sure. Unreliable narrators, really common. These are kind of going out of style, honestly. But this is going to be any narrator who, as they're telling the story, we start to question their credibility, right? We see these red flags and we're kind of like, wait a minute, I don't think I trust you. And a lot of times they're really morally ambiguous or even bad people, like a murderer. So it's kind of an interesting way of playing with ideas of like morality, reality, and just kind of getting us to question what we think we know. All right, I think that's everything. I hope you have a really great day, and yeah, I hope that I hope you've enjoyed reading with me this semester. I really had a great time reading everything that you've written. All right, have a great day.